What if one of the most ancient Bibles on the planet has been quietly carrying a message about the final days that most of humanity has simply never encountered, not concealed in some secret chamber, not buried beneath mysterious codes, but preserved across centuries in a place very few people ever think to look? Recently, filmmaker and actor Mel Gibson sparked genuine curiosity when he brought up the Ethiopian Bible, a version of Scripture that differs quite significantly from the one most of the world is familiar with today. Where many Bibles contain 66 books, the Ethiopian Bible holds more than 80, including ancient writings that were never brought into the Western canon. For generations, Ethiopia has carefully guarded these texts, passing them through monasteries and churches the way you would protect something truly irreplaceable. Among these writings are books like Enoch and Jubilees, texts that describe unusual events, spiritual warnings, and signs that seem to appear before great shifts in the world take place. So why is all of this drawing attention right now? According to Gibson, certain passages from these ancient writings appear to outline patterns of moral decline, widespread unrest, and deep spiritual confusion that sound strangely recognizable in today's world. Rather than offering a straightforward account of the end, these texts speak of a period of awakening, a time when buried truths begin rising to the surface, and people everywhere are pressed to reckon with the direction things are heading. It feels almost like stumbling upon an older, more detailed map for a journey everyone assumed they already had figured out. But if these ancient writings genuinely carry additional insight about what lies ahead, it opens up a striking question. Have we only ever been looking at a portion of the full picture? If you find yourself drawn to hidden history and ancient mysteries, be sure to like the video and subscribe for more. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church and its remarkable ancient texts deserve a closer look. For nearly 2,000 years, most Christians across the globe have been raised on the very same familiar story. Following his death on the cross, Jesus returned to life, revealed himself to those who followed him, and delivered a final message filled with hope and the promise of salvation. Yet in Ethiopia, certain very old Christian writings offer a deeper and far more troubling account of what took place after that resurrection, a version that most people in the Western world have simply never encountered. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church has preserved one of the earliest and most complete editions of the Bible that still exists today. Beyond the books familiar to other Christian traditions, their sacred scriptures also include several ancient texts that were never adopted into the Roman Church's Bible. These writings are thought to record teachings that Jesus passed on to his followers after he returned from death. Among them sits a powerful prophecy concerning the final era of humankind, one that reaches well beyond the warnings found in the Book of Revelation. For many centuries, Ethiopian monks protected these texts with extraordinary devotion. Inside quiet monasteries, they painstakingly transcribed every word by hand, passing the work from one generation to the next, determined that nothing would ever be lost. To these men, the writings were far more than historical records or spiritual meditations. They held the firm belief that the texts carried urgent messages intended for those who would come long after them. According to these ancient writings, Jesus did not depart from this world before describing what humanity would one day be forced to confront. He spoke of a distant era when the human spirit would become fragile, when truth would give way to distraction and spectacle, and when those holding positions of authority would project an image of holiness while turning their backs on the suffering of the poor and defenseless. These were not soothing words meant to bring comfort. They were solemn warnings designed to ready the world for what might eventually arrive. The Book of the Covenant, the End Times, prophecy. Among these ancient Ethiopian writings, one particular text carries an extraordinary weight. It goes by the name the Book of the Covenant. According to long-held tradition, this book preserves the conversations Jesus shared with his disciples across the 40 days following his resurrection before he departed from the earth for good. What sets this text apart is how directly it addresses the final chapter of human history. In this book, the onset of the end times does not arrive wrapped in sudden flames or dramatic collapse. Rather, Jesus describes something far quieter, yet considerably more disturbing, a slow erosion of the human conscience. this. He speaks of a generation that will carry his name on their lips, repeat his teachings aloud, and raise magnificent churches in his honor, while completely losing sight of the true spirit those words were meant to carry. The buildings may overflow with people, he explains, yet the living breath of genuine faith will have silently slipped away. The warning grows even more unsettling when he turns to the subject of false leaders. According to this prophecy, deception will not arrive solely from distant lands or easily recognized adversaries. It will take root inside the very institutions built in his name. Certain leaders will speak of heavenly things while quietly pursuing power, wealth, and personal influence down here on earth. Jesus cautions that whenever his message is twisted to justify harm, shield corruption, or silence the voices of those who are hurting, it signals that humanity is drifting dangerously close to a breaking point. The prophecy then shifts its gaze toward the natural world. Jesus describes strange and unsettling events, the shaking of the ground, rising waters, and peculiar signs appearing across the sky that will leave even the most learned people bewildered. Yet he clarifies that these occurrences are not simply acts of punishment. They are signals, much like the earliest waves of pain that come before a new life is born. He says the earth itself will stir in response to what lies ahead. Then comes a final warning. The ground trembling beneath your feet is not what should frighten you. What should is the moment human hearts become so numb that nothing stirs them at all. The Dcalia, the final empire, a separate Ethiopian volume known as the Dcalia, brings yet another layer to this prophecy. It records Jesus cautioning his followers about a final empire, a structure of power so enormous and so quietly hidden that most people would spend their lives inside it without ever realizing they were not free. He describes this empire as one that will not rely on chains. Instead, it will rely on comfort. It will hand people bread and distraction and present that arrangement as liberty. He goes on to say, "Blessed are those who recognize the cage and still choose love. Blessed are those who hunger for truth during an age of false abundance." These same writings also carry a striking vision of what the final days will genuinely feel like from within. Jesus says that in the last age, his voice will rise again from places no one expects, from deserts, from places of confinement, from the children of those the world has forgotten. He says his spirit will speak through those dismissed by the powerful, and that the most unsettling truth of the end times is precisely this: the people who believe themselves most prepared will be the very last to recognize what is unfolding. Why did Ethiopia preserve these texts? To grasp why these remarkable writings survived at all, you have to consider Ethiopia's distinct and deeply rooted Christian heritage. Christianity arrived in Ethiopia during the 4th century, and the faith developed there along its own path across many generations. Because the Ethiopian church remained largely apart from Rome for an extended period, it held on to traditions and writings that Western Christianity never adopted. That separation gave Ethiopian believers the space to maintain a wider and more spiritually rich collection of texts centered on the teachings of Jesus. Within these Ethiopian writings, the end times are not laid out simply as a sequence of catastrophes or global upheavals. The inner life of every person becomes the true arena where these struggles take place, at least according to how these writings frame things. The real confrontation of the last era, as these texts describe it, will not involve armies marching across battlefields or weapons being raised. It unfolds within each human soul. The choice being presented is described as one between honesty and comfort, between opening your eyes to what is real and staying gently asleep inside the warm shelter of familiar deceptions. Certain Ethiopian scholars and faithful believers have also offered explanations for why these prophecies remained largely unknown to the Western Church. One explanation they point to has to do with authority and influence. Church leadership in Rome may have favored teachings that kept ordinary people reliant on religious institutions for direction and for the hope of salvation, a message suggesting that divine wisdom could reach common people directly, particularly the poor and the lowly, would have threatened that entire arrangement. A second explanation concerns the visionary character of the writings themselves. These texts are filled with heavenly visions, divine counsels, and sweeping descriptions of cosmic timelines. Western authorities frequently regarded such ideas with deep suspicion, and they were sometimes branded as harmful or forbidden teachings. Then there is a third reason, which may simply come down to fear. Some believe that if people genuinely grasped what these messages were saying, they might come to understand that the final age the prophecies spoke of was not some distant event, but something already quietly taking shape around them. Regarding the 4 stages of the final era, certain Ethiopian texts describe how Jesus laid out this period in 4 distinct phases. The first is called the Age of Forgetting, when humanity gradually loses its hunger for truth. The second is the Age of Spectacle, when noise and endless entertainment crowd out genuine wisdom. The third is the Age of the False Shepherd, when corrupt figures claim the name of God and wield it as something to harm rather than to heal. The fourth and final stage, the one that makes scholars visibly uneasy, is what the text refers to as the Great Silence. Not a silence of calm or comfort, but a silence of the soul, a time when the bond between heaven and earth becomes so fragile that even those actively seeking can barely sense it. Jesus describes how, just before the final moment, at the very depths of this great silence, fire will return, not to bring ruin upon the world, but to rouse it one last time. The Ethiopian end times writings close with something the Western Church was deeply reluctant to let people hear. Jesus says, "The end is not the end of life, it is the end of the lie." He promises that those who chose love and truth, even while the rest of the world was chasing comfort and power, will not be forgotten. He says they will be recognized by their scars, not their crowns. The 7 seals of the heart. Another remarkable concept found within these Ethiopian writings is something Jesus refers to as the 7 seals of the heart. Unlike the vivid seals depicted in the Book of Revelation, these seals have nothing to do with great cosmic upheavals or supernatural occurrences. They speak instead to the inner state of a person's heart. Put simply, the real battle unfolds within us, not somewhere distant in the heavens. The first is called the seal of comfort. This describes a person who turns away from truth simply because facing it feels too uncomfortable. Rather than questioning or evolving, they settle into the reassuring shelter of familiar beliefs. The second is the seal of pride. This is when someone grows so convinced they already have all the answers that they cease to listen, to learn, or to reflect. The third is the seal of fear. It describes a life governed entirely by the desire for safety. When fear steers every choice a person makes, they grow willing to overlook truth just to preserve a sense of security. Then comes the seal of distraction. Every quiet moment gets stuffed with noise, entertainment, or endless busyness, leaving no room for deep thought or a higher calling to be heard. The fifth is the seal of false community, which takes hold when people surround themselves exclusively with those who share their views, building an echo chamber where genuine truth can no longer find its way in. The sixth is the seal of false mercy, where forgiveness becomes a convenient excuse to avoid growth or change altogether. The final seal, which Jesus describes as the most perilous of all, is the seal of religion itself, when sacred words, rituals, and long-held traditions become a kind of mask worn over a hollow, lifeless faith. According to the text, once a person breaks through all 7 of these internal barriers, something remarkable unfolds. Rather than standing still and waiting for a sign to fall from the sky, that person becomes the very spark of awakening the world has long been expecting. The prophecy of the final witness. Jesus was betrayed, put through tremendous suffering, and gave his life to bring salvation to the world. That is the version told in churches everywhere, handed down across generations, written in Bibles, captured in artwork, and painted into stained glass windows around the globe. Yet another account, one that adds a layer most Christians have never come across, has been carefully preserved far off in Ethiopia. Among the oldest manuscripts held within Ethiopian monasteries, there are claims that before Jesus ascended, he entrusted his disciples with something the Western Church left out entirely, a final prophecy, a sweeping and deeply unsettling vision of the world in its closing days. This testimony, known among Ethiopian scholars as the prophecy of the final witness, offers no soft edges around the end. It names it directly, it marks it in spiritual terms, and it describes the generation destined to live through it with a sharpness that leaves the modern reader feeling utterly shaken. In this rendition of the prophecy, Jesus tells those closest to him that the final witness is neither an angel nor some great cosmic sign. The final witness is an entire generation of ordinary people who will rise up in the deepest shadow of the last days and refuse to stay quiet. He says, "This generation will not be welcomed by those who hold power. They will be ridiculed, silenced, and removed from the stages and pulpits of their era. But their voices," he says, "will be heard where it truly matters. Not in grand arenas or across across screens, but deep within the hearts of those who are prepared to receive them. Jesus says to his disciples, "Do not be afraid if they take away your voice. Truth has no need of a microphone." According to Ethiopian theologians, the suppression of this prophecy was no accident. They hold that it was a deliberate decision made by the Council of Nika in 325 AD when church leaders under Roman influence chose which writings would define Christianity for the following 2,000 years. Ethiopian scholars say that council was deeply afraid of prophecies suggesting the church itself would fall into corruption during the final days. A prophecy declaring that the most dangerous false teachers of the end times would carry crosses and raise cathedrals was simply far too unsettling to preserve in the official record, and so those words were buried while Ethiopia kept them breathing. Ethiopia, the chosen keeper of truth. Ethiopia occupies a singular place within the full sweep of human history. It stands among the oldest civilizations this world has ever known, with a story stretching back across thousands of years. Through periods of war, the rise and fall of empires, and the steady turning of time, the country managed to protect something truly rare: its independence and its ancient ways. Unlike the vast majority of African nations, Ethiopia was never fully brought under colonial rule. Because of that, so many of its cultural customs, religious traditions, and sacred texts survived almost entirely untouched by outside hands. For many Ethiopians, their country is far more than a dot on a map. It carries a profound connection to biblical history. Certain traditions trace Ethiopian roots back to Ham, one of Noah's sons, a claim that surfaces in several ancient Jewish texts as well. Because of ties like these, Ethiopia is widely regarded as a living bridge between today's world and the earliest pages of biblical history. Faith has always sat at the very heart of Ethiopian identity. Christianity arrived in the region remarkably early, somewhere around the 4th century. Unlike many places where the faith was introduced through force or political maneuvering, Christianity in Ethiopia took hold organically and wove itself into the fabric of daily life. Over generations, it became something the people guarded with extraordinary devotion. By the 6th century, visitors were already describing Ethiopia as a well-established Christian kingdom. One of those visitors, the explorer Cosmos Indico Post, painted a picture of a land where faith ran through every layer of society. He also noted that Ethiopian rulers opened their doors to Christians who were fleeing hardship elsewhere, offering them shelter and a fresh start. Another truly remarkable aspect of Ethiopia's heritage is its Bible. The Ethiopian Church holds one of the oldest and most complete collections of biblical writings known to exist. While most modern Bibles are made up of 66 books, the Ethiopian Bible contains considerably more. Among its pages are ancient works like the Book of Enoch and the Book of Jubilees, texts that vanished from most Western traditions long ago. These writings were set down in Ge'ez, an ancient Ethiopian language that only a handful of scholars can decipher today. Because of that linguistic barrier, much of the wider world remained unaware of these texts for hundreds of years. Ethiopia's biblical canon actually exists in two distinct forms: a wider, more expansive collection, and a shorter official version that gained recognition later throughout history. Certain researchers suggest the extra texts found within the broader collection carry unusual prophecies and spiritual warnings that many people today are only just beginning to examine. Ethiopia's enduring independence, its deeply rooted ancient faith, and its carefully preserved scriptures have led numerous people to regard it as a quiet keeper of forgotten wisdom. While centers of religious authority frequently shifted across Europe and the Middle East over the centuries, Ethiopia kept safeguarding traditions that had nearly disappeared everywhere else. For historians and devoted believers alike, this leaves behind a genuinely fascinating question. Could it be that some of humanity's oldest spiritual insights about what lies ahead were quietly held and protected within this remarkable land the entire time?